It's time to talk 90s music on Road Gang Radio at the beautiful Degas House at the Fast Forward Studios. Take it away, Jimmy.
By the way, as a journalist, he's got a name that comes straight out of the 1940s and 50s in regards to making a deadline. Gary Graff is the author of 501 Essential Albums of the 80s and 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, which is what we're talking about today, where Gary and a cast of fellow music journalists, ink-stained wretches, present the most pivotal, impactful, and best albums of each decade across multiple genres: pop, rock, hip-hop, R&B, metal, country, alt-rock, and more. From the mega hits that everyone knows or owns to obscure yet influential albums, these are the albums that defined, as in the first book, the 80s, and now we're pivoting to the 90s and made both artistic and commercial impact. Essentially, these are 501 albums that stand the test of time. It's organized by year. There are knowledgeable opinions and reasons why each one is picked, as well as label, release date, and all the other stuff, the whole enchilada and the burrito on the side. In case you don't remember Gary, and how could you have forgotten him, he's an award-winning music journalist out of Detroit with some amazing stories. He's a regular contributor to Billboard, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Media News Group, Ultimate Classic Rock, The Consequence of Sound, and other publications, as well as radio stations in the Motor City and in, well, I would call it Beer City, Milwaukee. He's written books on rockers ranging from Alice Cooper to Neil Young. Welcome back to the show, Gary Graff.
Hey there. How are we?
Oh, we're doing great, man. It's good to have you back.
I will point out, by the 90s we were done with being ink stained. We were largely onto keyboards by then.
Oh, good point.
80s we were still in ink. 70s we were in hammers and chisels, and stone tablets. So.
Stone tablets. Well, Gary, welcome back. We had such a great time to get into 80s with you, although I was really just like, can we get on to next month because I need to talk about the 90s with all due respect to the 80s. But so very excited to have you back, and your opinion, your expertise here is exciting because I just want to dive in first of all because the 90s were such a cultural pivot going from analog to digital, MTV, Napster, and such a shifting climate. I'm wondering how that influenced your picks here because what is your reaction to critics who say, if they do, that that 90s music perhaps was the last maybe authentic era before streaming? Is that fair to say, or no?
I don't know that I call it the last authentic era of music. I think there's still plenty of authentic music past the 90s, even up till today. It was and
authentic, yes, but. Yeah, is it the last time though before we shifted to like all the noise? I guess I'll say of the extent.
Very much so. I write in the intro to this book that this is the last golden decade of the album. Mm-hmm. This was after we got Napster, after we got streaming, we really went back to a song-oriented consumption of music. There's still albums, of course, but in the 90s we were still excited about albums. It was the primary vehicle for consuming and listening to music. And that, and then, as we said, at the end of the decade, you're getting Napster, you're getting P2P, you're getting file sharing. That led to streaming and led to a whole different world order in listening to music. So I would say the 90s is the last decade of the authentic album experience.
I wanted to kind of follow that up and follow up the technology aspect because we want to get to the music. In the 70s and 80s, if you wanted to be your own DJ, you needed a cassette player and a whole lot of patience. As we move through the 90s, everybody almost becomes their own personalized DJ because they can begin, after the album begins to slowly fade out, they can begin to assemble their own version of what a playlist looks like. They can do it, and they can do it very quickly. And this kind of goes back to it. This is like the last hurrah of like getting in a line, standing outside, and picking up an album and then a CD on the moment of release and kind of devouring the album and looking for meaning inside of what is the overall feel of this thing, what are they going for. It becomes more about songs again. That's kind of what you guys are getting at, right?
Yeah, it was very much still an old school type of experience of immersing yourself in a long playing musical experience. It's really what we still had that going on in the 90s, and long player even took on a different definition because it was all CDs. You know, vinyl was gone, cassettes were going, so it was CDs, and a lot of artists felt the need to use all 70 minutes available on that CD, sometimes to a fault. Not everybody has a 70-minute album in them. You know, that's the equivalent of what in the 70s and the 80s would have been a 2-record set. So but you still were immersing yourself in that long, complete experience with one artist.
Okay, speaking of immersing yourself, I want to talk about an album that won 9 Grammy Awards, Album of the Year. It made it the youngest artist to win the award at that time for Best Rock Album, Best Female Rock Vocal Performance, and Best Rock Song, and Best Long-Form Music Video. I'm talking about It's Like Rain on Your Wedding Day. Okay, this album, Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. I'm curious your take, Gary, on, like, that was such an iconic record. It defined a lot of my life. I feel like it's now out in musical form. But why does something like that? How can and I know that once we come out with something that's that big and that becomes that anthemic, whether anybody knew the success it was going to have or not, the follow up is obviously very hard. And Alanis, after that record, you know, there wasn't something ever as big as that. Why is that? How can something like that be so amazing, and then we don't have anything like that record from her again?
Well, you know, I think when you do scale those heights, and this could even be true of Michael Jackson with Thriller, you know, as popular as the follow-ups were to that, not many artists, very few and almost none, in fact, achieved those heights back to back to back to back. It's hard, and it's lightning striking. So Alanis Morissette hit just at the right moment. You know, we liked our angst in music again. We wanted the pain. She had us in what she did in the theater, you know, and You Ought to Know. And it just connected. And we were ready, too, I think, for a big female artist. We had them in the pop world, but the rock world really did need, at that point, the alternative rock world especially, needed a good, strong female standard bearer, and so Jagged Little Pill dropped just at the right time, and it just doesn't happen. You know, back-to-back scaling the kind of heights you just described with her with the Grammys and the sales and everything. You know, Bare Naked Ladies even will talk to you about how Stunt, you know, their album during the 90s, their big hit album, which was 4 million. It wasn't as big as Jagged Little Pill, but they realized at the time, we won't get here again. You know, let's just keep it. This is our ticket to make the kind of music we want to from here on out. And I think Alanis Morissette did that. You know, I think she walked away from the Jagged Little Pill experience feeling empowered, licensed, maybe a little nervous, but ultimately understanding that this was literally lightning striking. I can't control that. I'm going to make my music and let the proverbial chips fall where they may. And she still has had plenty of success. And, you know, she's been touring the last few years doing sellout business, mostly on the strength of Jagged Little Pill. And I think the smart artist does recognize that. You know, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, which, by the way, is fine. You make a record like that, you've done your Picasso piece for the world. You can go live your life, go forth and prosper. So totally fine. It's kind of that moment. Now you get to be like, now what do I want to do forever? And she's doing some really cool work and a lot of cultural and prolific work out there, right, Jim?
And if you're smart, you then do it on your own terms.
Yes, exactly.
Listen who you are, whether you're Alanis Morissette or Nirvana or Smashing Pumpkins or Oasis or Garth Brooks or whoever.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that too that ends up happening, that a lot of people had figured out the lesson from earlier decades too. A lot of people would have these big hit albums and then end up broke 5 years later because they never could recapture it. A lot of these people end up a lot smarter and saying, as it happens with Bare Naked Ladies and with Alanis Morissette, the idea that this ain't going to happen again. It's almost as if people got managers in the 80s and 90s who were like the guy that stood behind the Roman emperor after the triumph and whispered in their ear, remember that all men are mortal and that all fame is fleeting. I want to kind of go back to an earlier period because there's an argument to be made that 91, and it's 90 or 91 when we get the tale of the two flannels, Nirvana and Pearl Jam. It come out at the exact same time, and that kind of really dictates policy for a lot of what rock becomes. And there are bands, however, that do continue. U2, REM from the 80s, but a lot of bands that show up in the early 90s who end up kind of dominating the scene with a pressure to release monster albums over and over again does kind of weigh upon them, and they try to keep up with it, right?
They did, sure. And those are great. Pearl Jam and Nirvana, that was 91, but it was actually something that began during the late 80s because that's when we had Alice in Chains emerge from Seattle and Soundgarden, and it was, during 88, 89, we started to feel the sea change, in rock especially, into something a little bit heavier, a little bit darker and dirgier, but then you did have Nirvana and Pearl Jam blast off into mega platinum territory, just become sensations, and these were artists that struggled with that. They did not want to be rock stars. They did, but they wanted to be rock stars on their own term, and they didn't want the kind of adulation or mania that they wound up experiencing. And both of those bands especially really grappled with it, and it became very awkward. And of course, in the case of Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, it became tragic when he committed suicide. Pearl Jam handled it in their own way, and they had a lot of awkward moments throughout the 90s. But this was where you did have music that had a very serious intent and a very darker kind of mood and countenance to it. And if those artists wanted to stay true to where they were coming from musically, it was always in direct opposition to what the music business made them into.
So, Gary, last night I got to perform at the Country Music Hall of Fame, and I performed with Tony Arata, who wrote the dance for Garth Brooks. Yep. And we got into a long discussion. I told him that I was going to be on the show with you today, and so we got into a discussion. And then backstage, and the makeup artists were debating which, she's 40, debating with somebody. We had somebody in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 60s, and 70s, all backstage debating albums last night because of your interview today, which was kind of a fun scene. But we got into, first of all, talking. Well, I'll ask the first question, going back to the dance and Garth Brooks, because that song, the dance, came out in 1990, but it was on the tail end of the album, the self-titled album that came out in the late 80s. But then No Fences comes out later that year. A whole new record comes out in August that year, back when they were putting out, these big banger records. So let's talk about the country scene in the 90s, because 90s country, to me, is everything. Is everything, and it's a feeling though. So can you talk about why anybody who's listening who is a 90s country fan? I think even if you're not a country fan, you can. Well, no, I'm going to take that back. It's a feeling for me because I grew up listening to it. But whether you're a fan of it or not, you know what I'm talking about, Gary, that there's some sort of feel, there's some sort of sound that they were capturing on the popular 90s records. What was it that they were putting in the crack pipe that we were smoking at that time?
90s country became rock and roll. Is what happened. And it started in 89, the very famous class of 89 with Garth and Clint and Alan and all the rest of the guys, Travis. But it became, you're talking about a group of artists here who, and it extends to, the Dixie Chicks, later in the decade, Winona Judd when she went solo. These were artists that were raised on both country and rock and roll. And they found a way to incorporate elements of both into but you'll remember the radio format when it was called New Country. Okay, and you know, that was an interesting time period too.
Yeah.
We could talk hours about this, but the establishment of branding something of the brand New Country was essentially to say there was something wrong with old country, and you almost completely wiped out a couple generations of country music in launching, you know, this new form of country music. But what they had was a rock and roll attitude and a little more of a pop savvy, if you will, mainstream pop savvy type of approach to making country music, but they still kept the twang. There was still steel and fiddles and banjos as part of the sound, but it rocked. And the studio, the production clarity was also, it was brighter and crisper, and the sound of country music sounded much more contemporary in the 90s. So, and you had a bunch of great artists, great personalities, as well as great artists who were also putting on great live shows. It wasn't just people, you know, standing around picking and grinning anymore.
Yeah.
You know, Garth Brooks, Clint Black, all these guys were putting on arena rock shows, and they made country relevant to a much younger audience. And again, very quickly, it just wasn't that country necessarily capitulated to rock and roll. It just found a way to bring that attitude and that flavor into established country music sounds.
Well, and it's fun. I just want to say real quick, and then to Jim, to your question. But Gary, last night, since you mentioned the Dixie Chicks, I was also performing with Marcus Hummon, who wrote "Ready to Run" and "Cowboy Take Me Away," and he told a great story into "Cowboy Take Me Away," how he wrote "Ready to Run" with them before they were the Dixie Chicks that we came to know, before they were the chicks that we came to know, but about how he wrote with them on "Ready to Run," and they were just at a coffee shop, and then got the call back to write with them when they wrote Cowboy. And he's like, and then that time, which was not very long after, he's like, at that point, I had to drive an hour out of town. There were armed guards at a gated community. He said that's the switch flipped so quickly. But I think that's to your point of the sound, that it was like all of a sudden we heard something that we didn't know. So to your point, I love that take of we country became rock and roll then, and it was literally like a switch flipped almost, and everything skyrocketed. So Jim, that's that feeling we talk about. So I love hearing the stories behind the songs and what was going on and what was going through the minds of even Natalie. Like, oh, now we were the Dixie Chicks. Now we're the Dixie Chicks. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Exactly.
I found this wonderful video of Merle Haggard impersonating everybody from Johnny Cash to Glenn Campbell, all these different artists, and then eventually all the artists that he was impersonating come out and they join him on the stage. What I noticed was they kept cutting back to the audience, and the audience, of course, was sitting down and applauding politely for these moments as if they were in a theater. And the people you guys are talking about, and you brought this up, I began to realize as I was looking at all those albums, the debt that is owed to Chris Christopherson, by the way. I just want to say, the idea of that first kind of, I almost think that he becomes kind of a bridge for a lot of these people of how do you create a rock and roll atmosphere with a country and western show. And and Brooks, of course, Garth Brooks, of course, becomes kind of the master of it. But there really is a sense that they seem to come out of nowhere. There are antecedents, but part of the would you say part of the novelty of all of that, where it just explodes? We've heard explodes on the scene. Was there that feeling around that? I remember being like, where did all these country guys come from in the top 40? I'm hearing it everywhere now. I was, once again, in Athens, Georgia, hearing all this stuff. Did it just kind of happen overnight? Is there a switch flip that causes this?
Well, I think if you were having covered it as a journalist in real time, I remember when we went through in the 80s, these various attempts with the kind of brand at the time was "This Country's Rockin'," and you had acts like Foster and Lloyd and Sweethearts of the Rodeo, and it never entirely connected. And it really was. I think it was more a function of industry as much as the music, that they found the right brand for a new country format, new country, young country. The way they were branding it, and that got listeners and fans to pay attention, especially teenagers, people in their 20s, like, oh, young country, I'm young. I'm gonna
Great
listen to
marketing.
And then you had this disenfranchised part of the rock world that was more about the Bob Segers and the Bruce Springsteens and the John Mellencamp's and those type of singer-songwriter-based artists, and were not connecting with Nirvana and Pearl Jam and grunge and alternative rock, but they were getting it from Garth Brooks, and getting it from closer to that feeling with Alan Jackson and Travis Tritt and those artists, Vince Gill even at the time, Lyle Lovett coming along. That was closer to that kind of rock they loved than Kurt Cobain was. Go ahead.
No, I was actually just going to remind people of the title of this book. It's 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, and to give people a perspective on how wonderful this book is, it's all organized by, it's a chronological, year-by-year deal, but you will often have stuff like Neil Young's Harvest Moon, a magnificent album, and by the way, he'd been doing it a long time, right up against, and it's right next to, on the same page, the debut self-titled Rage Against the Machine. And I just love the fact that it's as if there's something about the 90s, and I would love your take on this, the idea that a lot of trends that have been building up for decades, from the late 50s all the way to that moment, and everything, everywhere, all at once seemed to be happening at that moment, where you could have a classic like Harvest Moon come out at the same time as Rage Against the Machine debuts. Is that a fair assessment, that a lot of things kind of bubbled up and all of them kind of tried to fight for position while at the same time acknowledging there was room for everybody for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great read of it. Sounds like you read the introduction to the book, which I appreciate. That was part of the magic of the '90s, is how much different music was going on, and how good so much of it was. I mean, you had people like U2 puts out one of their best albums ever, Achtung Baby. Tom Petty puts out Wildflowers. At the same time, you did have Nirvana, Nevermind. You had Pearl Jam's first 3 albums. You had that whole Britpop wave that came about with Oasis and Blur and bands like that. You had the real rise of gangsta rap, creating its own subgenre within the hip hop world. You had the new movement of boy bands, God help us, and then you had electronic music, which was really it went from electronic music went from being Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream to being the new disco, electronic dance music, and creating real artists and real personalities within that realm. So yeah, we were all over the place in the 90s, just like we were today. And the 90s really was the introduction of that kind of aesthetic, that there's all this different kinds of music, and now it's accessible to all of us.
So how do you we've been talking about, we've been talking about the Country Music Hall of Fame versus the Rock and Roll Music Hall of Fame, which I want to ask you a question about here in a second. But I just rewatched the Defiant Ones recently, the Dr. Dre documentary, which was so good, and I stand up watching that because I'm like moving around my house and I was like amped up. But so in this time with, rock blending with country, as we've been talking about, with hip hop going mainstream this time, how do you approach those genre blurring moments when picking essential records? Because also, like I said, there's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is allowing country people in, but Country Hall of Fame doesn't necessarily allow rock in, which is something we debate about a lot right here. But so when we're talking the genre blurring moments, with it being so across the board, was 90s more difficult to, I say, narrow it down? 500 albums is a lot, but still to narrow it down, is that harder in the 90s versus the 80s because of the genre blurring?
They were about the same, because the issue you had in the 80s that was different was you had significant artists putting out significant albums almost every year. By the time we got to the 90s, the industry across the board, whether it was rock, country, R&B, or whatever, had accepted the idea that you can take a couple of years, 3 years, in some cases more, and not risk losing your audience. So the output wasn't quite the same. Yes, there were a lot of albums we considered. I think the spreadsheet was something like 2,600 albums that we looked at from which to whittle down to the 501. And because there were more genres, it gave us more artists and more albums. But in the end, you just take the albums on their own merits and their own impact. So something like Dr. Dre, The Chronic, gets really gets the same weight as, I don't know, Emmylou Harris, Wrecking Ball, or Dixie Chicks, Wide Open Spaces, or Tom Petty's Wildflower.
Oh my God, so good.
But you just have to or Santana, Supernatural. You just have to think about what that album was qualitatively, and also the impact it made and its importance as part of the decade. So really, just because there were more genres, I don't think we felt a different charge in the way we judged it.
Gotcha.
We just had to grapple with a big long list and argue about it.
And the fact, by the way, that the Southern Harmony and Musical Companion is the most badass album in the world to walk across a hot asphalt while going to get a cold beer that has ever been written, while sexy people walk in the other direction.
Very specific.
I have to tell you, man. Go ahead.
I want to throw in that. So we had this is a good example of all that. Black Crowes. The first couple albums, we really had to make a decision there. And, which one? Shake Your Money Maker, obviously the big breakthrough. Great rock and roll record, but I went with Southern Harmony because I just felt like that was the album that established the Black Crowes and the Black Crowes sound.
Yeah, because it felt like they were here to stay. Really quickly, our good friend...
Great differentiation, though. What great album versus what establishes the sound.
Oh, that's a good one, too. Brad Bentley has a question before we get out of here. The guy who actually is the president of the company that's sponsoring this studio is
the
here
guy
this
who
morning.
pays for the studio, Gary, so we have to take his question.
Better answer this right.
No, not a question. But this list came together. One of the ones in my mind was actually "Shake Your Moneymaker" from the Black Crowes, which I think came out in '90.
Yeah.
And what I remember about that, I'm a Southern rock guy, right? You mentioned keyboards at the beginning of this segment, and Chuck Leavell played keyboards on that album. There's actually a tie into Lindsay Lawler because he was in the audience at the U.S. Capitol when she sang at the Capitol Christmas tree lighting.
Well, he picked my song. That's how I got to play
yes,
at it.
There you go.
Shameless plug.
All kinds of groovy stuff. Gary, please come back. We'll just make up reasons for you to come back. We'll just invent.
I just want to nerd out with Gary every day of my life.
Anytime.
We're going to invent topics. Gary Graff is the author of 501 Essential Albums of the 80s and 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, along with a whole bunch of other, journalistic miscreants. And by the way, I count myself among them. You can find...
By the way, I'm sorry, but make sure this is also, Jem, before you finish out where to find it, the artwork is so, just remembering there's nostalgia in just the artwork. We didn't even get into that. So this makes not only a great reference book, but a great coffee table book, a great conversation starter. Have it out when you have dinner parties. Trust me, then you don't have to figure out small talk with people you don't like. Carry on, Jim.
By the way, you can find him on the X, formerly known as Twitter, at Graff on Music, GARAFFON Music, and then on Facebook on Gary Graff on Music. Head on over there. Thank you, Gary. As always, you're welcome back anytime, my friend.
All right, extend the invitation, and I'll be here.
All right.
Thank